So we know that there's diversity within American Indians or Native American groups. And there are many tribal groups within Native Americans or American Indians. There are over 100 tribes with distinctive culture, language, values, and heritage and traditions. So it's logical to assume that institutional racism may affect these different tribes differently. And according to Dr. Healy, there used to be more Native Americans and American Indians before the European immigrants came about hundreds of years ago. And according to Dr. Healy, some of the European immigrants, they spread diseases, infectious diseases, to Native Americans. So from being the majority group, they became, and they are still the minority group to this day. And according to Dr. Healy, they face prejudice, discrimination, and racism. And the dominant group, maybe the European immigrants during that time, hundreds of years ago, had different agendas on American Indians and African Americans. Their purpose was to reduce military threats with respect to American Indians and control slaves with respect to African Americans. So, in this paragraph, it's logical to assume that institutional racism affects African Americans and American Indians differently. And they depended on hunting, agriculture, and other food sources for survival. Maybe to this day, they still do some of these things. And their livelihood was affected during the infectious disease era when the European immigrants first came over. And in general, their society heavily depends on subsistence technology. That's how they live. That's how they survive. And because of that, when the early European immigrants, they forced assimilation and acculturation on Native Americans and American Indians. It affected them to a great deal. It affected their upward mobility. And because of that, things are not equal between American Indians and whites to this day, partly because of forced assimilation and acculturation. And maybe, in my humble opinion, it was unintentional on the part of these early European immigrants. And this is how I perceive this issue. You don't need to agree with me. We've been through this before. Industrial Revolution took place in Europe first. And because of that, countries in Europe, they were a few steps ahead when compared to countries in other continents. Or the European or the Caucasians were somewhat more advanced than other racial ethnic groups. And Native Americans or American Indians, they did not have any concept of private property. Maybe the land they used to hunt, to fish, or the land they used for agriculture, they considered their property to some degree. So they had a different idea about property compared to the earlier European immigrants, and they also had a different concept pertaining to election and democracy. And they were proud of their heritage. And because of that, maybe they cling to their heritage, which should be encouraged. Maybe partly because of that, they continue to lag behind in education and occupational attainment and other areas of social mobility. And when the European first came over, they forbade the Native Americans or American Indians to practice their language, to practice their religion and their culture. They built boarding schools for the younger generations of Native Americans and American Indians when these people, they weren't ready for that. We all know that. So this is my take on the issue. The Westerners did not give them enough time to try to understand the culture, belief, and values and traditions of the American Indians and Native Americans. This was why, maybe partly why, they forced assimilation on them. And because of that, the Western schools did not sufficiently prepare the young generations of American Indians or Native Americans to learn a new language, to learn a different culture, to learn a different ways of life, to learn other preferences and tastes and knowledge and hobbies. So this is a manifestation of institutional racism on Native Americans and American Indians. And some were isolated on their reservations. And this can be another form of institutional racism. And we know that reservations, they are different. Their social and economic contexts are very different from the other neighborhoods, the other kinds of neighborhoods. And it's logical to assume that many of the reservations, what they have in terms of amenities, infrastructure, and other services, they still lag behind many of the white neighborhoods. So this can be a manifestation of environmental racism and institutional racism. And this can also be a manifestation of residential segregation and hyper-segregation. They were, or they are still, very isolated. And even though attempts were being tried to close the gaps, income gaps, wealth gaps, education gaps, and other kinds of disparities among different racial ethnic groups, like Blacks, American Indians, and Native Americans, they continue to lag behind other racial ethnic groups. They are more vulnerable to economic hardships, maybe due to their low level of education, and maybe some of them are unskilled in the eyes of the factory owners and other modern business enterprises. I would say that they are skillful in their traditional or ethnic-based enterprises like hunting, agriculture, or fishing, or something, or weaving, or something else. But they were also affected during the economic restructuring. If they moved to the urban areas and took jobs in factories, like Blacks, they had very few transferable skills to move to another industry when those factories were being moved to Asia, to different countries in Central and Latin America. So, this can be another portrayal of institutional racism. They're being disadvantaged due to the historical context, like blacks. And it seems that this kind of discrimination and racism continue to be embedded in the structure of the economic system and the structure of the government at different levels. So it still made it hard for them to transition to a different industry, to acquire a different skill for another industry during the economic restructuring from the 70s until the 90s. And their social networks look very different from the whites. And because of that, it's hard for them to use their personal and business connections to advance themselves, to attain upward social mobility. This is especially so if they remain in the reservation for almost all their life. And because of that, it's hard for them, even if they are wealthy, they had the economic means, they had the financial means, it's still hard for them to transfer these economic resources or financial resources into social networks beyond their family and kin. So they practically know the same people throughout their lives. This is especially so if they haven't moved out from the reservations. And when we know the same person from childhood years to old age, the information we are going to get from these people are going to be practically the same from childhood years to old age. It's a no-brainer. And because of that, it's hard for us to advance in terms of social economic statuses and to learn the know-how or cultural capital of those different from us, our taste and preference and hobbies for music, for wine, for art, our proclivities, our preferences may remain the same if we know the person, the same people from childhood years to old age. So it's almost impossible for us to convert our economic advantages into different know-hows or cultural capital.